Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Mike, we have an interesting guest today at a very interesting point in the Canadian journey in reconciling our relationship with First Nations.
Today you're meeting with Jennifer Manuel. She's a interesting person, interesting background. She's not First Nations, not Aboriginal, but she's lived with First Nations community in very remote parts of BC. She's been a teacher in First Nations communities, and now she's an author. She's just come out with a work of fiction in 2016. And she had an interesting experience in putting this book out. She saw in great relief really the awareness of First Nations issues among non-First Nations, but not really the depth of understanding. And so she has come up with an interesting idea that's around the fact that we have National Aboriginal Day coming up at the end of June, June 21st. She's issued a challenge. It's called the TRC Reading Challenge. As you know, a little over a year ago, in late 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after 7 years of work, released its report on the residential school travesty and tragedy in our history. And so it's been over a year now that that report's been out, but she really feels, Jennifer Manuel, that not enough Canadians have really read it and thought about it and thought about what does this mean for our collective identity as Canadians. So she's issued a challenge initially to 1,000 people to say, I'll read the report. It's hundreds of pages of long. She's far exceeded her goal. She already has 3,000 people that have signed up on her website. And the nice thing is, if you're really interested in doing this, your name's appearing on her website that you've bought into this challenge.
So you pointed out we're a year out since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was issued by Justice Murray Sinclair. Where are we at since then? Has anything happened? Has anything been done with this? Has the landscape in Canada with regards to relations with First Nations changed or even shifted at all?
Well, Murray Sinclair is now a member of the Canadian Senate. That changed.
With conditions, I understand.
With conditions. He told the Prime Minister, I'll serve, but I'm going to sit as an independent. And so he's now a member of the Senate. And some take great comfort from the fact that we have a person in the Parliament who is intimately aware with the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, can speak for it, can push for it. And so it's early days, I think, would be the fair assessment. In his own interviews that he's done recently, Senator Sinclair has said that really not a lot measurable change, but we've had a change in government. As I've talked to people in this genre, they say, there has been a change in government in Canada, so it's sort of unfair to expect that a whole lot would have happened, but there have been some commitments from the new government. Some very symbolic and others very pointed and real. $8 billion commitment from the new government over the next 5 years towards First Nations issues. Our new government has an Attorney General who is from our neck of the woods here in British Columbia, First Nations. We did have a fisheries minister, Hunter Tutu from Nunavut, who's had to resign for personal reasons. But obviously a commitment from the Prime Minister early days to appoint First Nations, Aboriginals to his cabinet. There's been a commitment to follow through with a inquiry, a federal official inquiry into missing and murdered women. And so steps are being taken and people are taking heart from that. But to go back to your guest today, Jennifer Manuel, she's more concerned about us, regular folks. Are we really, particularly non-First Nations, are we really doing what it takes to understand the history, the challenges, and committing ourselves as citizens, non-First Nation citizens, to acknowledge the history, acknowledge the past, and to try to make this part of a Canadian priority?
Are we? Are we paying attention? Have we, issuing this challenge, because are people aware of the TRC? Are they aware of the recommendations? Are they aware of Aboriginal issues? So what have we learned about what people in this country know?
Well, we went out on the street and asked this question of fellow Canadians, and unfortunately, not a whole lot. There's not a lot of knowledge of it. So it's clear that Jennifer Manuel is on to something. But the fact that she's more than tripled her goal of people signing on to read the challenge by National Aboriginal Day on June 21st would seem to be an indicator that there's a growing momentum and desire to learn more. She's really about non-First Nations people need to acknowledge, she calls it their privilege. The identity and the history and the experience that we have and how very different it is from First Nations, and that first and foremost that privilege has to be acknowledged right up front. And that the next step of digging in and being open to understanding the First Nations history and story, and particularly the residential school story, is the critical next step.
Well, let's go take a look at that report that you've put together.
We're asking people what they know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I don't know anything about it.
Have you heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
No, I have not.
Oh, I don't know anything.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Inform the federal government on their rights towards Aboriginal populations in Canada?
We don't know anything about it.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
No idea.
Have you heard of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission report?
Yes.
Okay, and have you had a chance to read it?
No.
I think maybe something, but just vaguely.
We're just asking people if they know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Not really.
I don't know anything.
I'm not aware of it, sorry. Thanks.
Oh, probably talking to the wrong person.
Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Unfortunately, I don't know anything, sorry.
Hi, ma'am. We're asking people what they know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report.
I don't know.
I've not heard of that.
Oh, okay.
It is unfortunate. But if people want to pick up this challenge, once again, what's that website?
It's TRC, which stands for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, trcreadingchallenge.com, all one big word. And again, this was 7 years of work by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into the very sad and tragic history of residential schools and First Nations.
Thanks for that, Mike. Let's now go to that conversation with Jennifer Manuel. Welcome. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When we take a look at it, it is the end of a very long history that is not a comfortable subject for most Canadians.
Right.
Why do you think that it's important to challenge people to read it?
Well, I think the primary reason is because there's not enough engagement in our public discourse. There's not enough people actually participating in a dialogue about the relationship between First Nations and non-First Nations in our country. And I do not think that you can rightfully participate in that dialogue unless you first listen to the truths that First Nations people have expressed, which are contained in that commission report.
I got to get you to hang on for just a second here while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
It's pretty harrowing reading.
Yes.
Like, you are reading about people's lives who have been brutalized. There was a line that I was reading that said, basically they were subjected to an attempt at cultural genocide.
Yes.
Cultural genocide. So when you launched this challenge, had you read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
No. And in fact, I'm participating alongside. I'd read many snippets, and I'd read the portions about what reconciliation meant, the principles of reconciliation, but I had not read the whole book. And so come June 21st, when people start actually marking their progress on the website, my name will be there as well.
Have you started reading it in the meantime, or are you waiting until then?
I've dipped into it, but largely in my mindset is that it officially starts for me on June 21st.
Let's talk about what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was about, because even though you may not have read it all, you know what it's about.
Sure.
What was the TRC attempting to do?
Well, it was attempting to it was a vehicle through which the people who had suffered abuses, emotional, physical, sexual abuses in the residential schools could have their testimony to speak their truth. And it's part of a larger attempt to a foundation from which you can then build future calls to action in this larger parameter of what reconciliation means between the government and the First Nations, between the churches, hopefully, and the First Nations. But I think that when people start engaging themselves, just regular citizens, I hope that it would become more than just the government. It's all of Canada and First Nations people.
Well, I think it's important that we do it, but most people aren't paying attention. The irony of the fact that you and I are both Caucasian and we're talking about this doesn't escape me, but there was in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Elder Mary Deliri of the Anishinaabe, which is a group that are called Divine Breath, or made of flesh, blood, soul, and spirit. They lived primarily in Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and into the United States. She says, even through all of the struggles, all that has been disrupted, we can still hear the voice of the land. We hear the care and love for the children. And she goes on to say, this land is made up of the dust of our ancestors' bones. And she's referring to both First Nations and non-indigenous peoples. And so to reconcile with this land and everything that has happened, there is much work to be done in order to create balance. You've worked in First Nations communities. How do we go about creating some of that balance and the true reconciliation, which is respect for one another, that Justice Sinclair calls for in the issuing of the final report? How do we go about doing that? Because you spent quite a bit of time in First Nations communities.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. The very first one is a belief and a willingness in the idea of listening deeply. And listening deeply to another person means that you're not just hearing them, you are listening with the attitude that you are open to being changed by what you hear. And I think that's often how people don't listen. And that was part of the purpose of doing the pledge in the way that I'm doing it, because it's like going to a restaurant with your friend and you have something very important to tell them, and they're distracted and they're looking all around, and you say, you're not really listening to me. And they report back to you. It turns out they've heard everything you've said. That's not enough for a relationship. You have to show somebody that you are listening deeply. And so that's part of the idea that I had, is that all those names, we're now up to almost 3,000, all those names are a way of saying these people are demonstrating that they're about to listen deeply. And so it's a showing that we're listening. And so I think that's the first way. The second way is a belief that, and this it runs parallel to what you just said, a belief that decolonization is not just going to fade away. Like, it's not just going to happen on its own. Colonization, the colonial legacy, is not just going to go away after some time. We all have a responsibility. It's not just about Indigenous people. It's about non-Indigenous people having a moral obligation to be part of it. And in order to do that, I think that we have to create this balance you're talking about, we meaning non-First Nations people, have to first of all accept that there is a colonial legacy that affects us by having privilege that others don't, other First Nations people don't. And also addressing, acknowledging, accepting that we have deeply embedded beliefs that our ways of seeing and knowing and being are somehow superior, and starting to, and it's hard to unravel those because they're systemic, they're so embedded in our language and everything we do in our society, but start to actually be aware of that and start to try and untangle that.
Unfortunately, we have to take a second break right now. I wish that we could just keep going, but we have to take a commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Well, as you're speaking, I'm going, okay, in the 90 some odd shows that we've produced so far, I've done close to 20 that I've dedicated to issues related to First Nations, whether it's the Silcoteen decision, whether it's closing the gap with Perry Bellegarde. I had Buffy St. Marie in here.
Right.
We talked about the doctrine of discovery. And every time that I run a program where First Nations is the theme, viewership goes down. And it's really disappointing to me, because when you try and talk to non-Indigenous people or those who aren't aware of our history, they want to turn a blind eye to it. And if we continue to do that, I think that we do ourselves a disservice.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that is the third prong of that colonial legacy is recognizing how deeply interconnected First Nations and non-First Nations people are in the country. And a lot of people, like you say, refuse to think that they have no connection to any of that. I mean, but if we look at the statistics, if you read a book like Dances with Dependency, which looks at the statistics of the labor force, just as something that might trigger some people to perk up a bit, and you look at the growing labor force and the birth rate of First Nations people and their growing labor force, they are essential to our economy. So if people only care about the practicality and not the morality, then I think that will start to change as those statistics continue to grow.
In these communities, you are looking at the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of parents and grandparents and so on who went through the 100 years of the residential school program. And what has that done to their relationship with education and also their overall well-being, and has it compromised their future going forward?
Yeah, I think, it's, from my experience, yes, it has affected how parents and some grandparents see the school, the lack of trust they have in the school. But overall, I'd say it's still an individual response, because in my experience, you may have one grandparent who went through residential school and has very little trust in the school, and you can have another one from the same community who also went through residential school who believes and supports that school so fully. And so it really is, there's quite a variation in the responses.
So be careful not to generalize.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we sort of move forward with your challenge, I'm sure that there are a lot of people who will look at what you're doing and saying, that was then, this is now, like, why do we need to revisit that? Let's get on with it. What's the value of revisiting the past so that we can move forward into the future?
Well, I think the biggest value is the fact of that it hasn't really been addressed. And I think that people who see it in the news a lot and get cynical and say, like, this is old news, but has it ever really been addressed? And so I think that it's, it goes back to what I said about listening. And there still needs to be a time period in which there's that listening goes on in order for everybody to move forward, and that never really happened. And so I think that for a lot of people who have pledged to read it, this is a lot of the comments that have been sent to me by email after they pledge is the feeling of, I didn't know what to do, and I wanted to do something, and now at least there's something concrete to be done. And I don't think it's that they feel self-congratulatory. I think that these are honest responses, that they genuinely wanted to reach out and at the very least, listen.
This is our final break. It'll only take a moment or two, and then we'll be back for the conclusion.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So then what is the answer? What can we do as individuals? So reading the Truth and Reconciliation final report would be one thing that helps me to understand. But beyond that, let's say I read it and go, okay, I want to be able to do something, but what can I do that doesn't come across as being a fraud?
I think the only thing you can do, the best thing is the best contribution you can make is to continue to try to, on a personal level, unravel those, the colonial legacy that is embodied within yourself, and keep working on that. And the more you talk about it to other non-First Nations people or whatever, I think it's a slow process, but I think that really should be, we always have this notion of, look to yourself first and how you can improve yourself. And I think that's it.
Well, on my own journey to understand what has happened in Canada, it's become very important to me that I learn to deal with all people, first of all, and First Nations, because I am now more acutely aware of the history, that I do so with respect, and that I convey that I respect you in a way that, I'm not here to change you. I'm not here to do anything. My interaction with you is just as one person to the next. You have your life, I have mine. Let's hope that this was a successful interaction between us. We move on. And I'm not hoping that, in the rearview mirror, I'm going, oh, wasn't I a good person?
Yeah.
No, I just want to, treat people with respect, no matter what their background is. It's fascinating to me, your challenge already, because I looked up something that said the 7 flames that are in the logo around the TRC. I had no idea what they stood for. Truth, humility, honesty, wisdom, respect, courage, and the most important, I think, is love. They are the 7 sacred teachings of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And I think that it's a great way for us to be. I think that there's an opportunity for us to embrace much of First Nations culture to enrich who we are as Canadians. I applaud you for launching this challenge, because it once again raises the bar just a little bit, and hopefully a few more people will read it. I'll be joining you on the challenge.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thanks.